I was in the barn pondering all this stuff, it was truly a sort of an existential crisis, because all of the things that I had come to believe as true were being confronted with harsh factual reality, and yet the implications of that are profound. If we can't have a perpetually growing economic system because we live on a finite planet, then that raises questions about our entire debt-based economic system, and shifting off of our debt-based economic system that demands exponential growth to service ever-increasing debt is a profound shift that most people aren't even thinking about yet. And so I began to think, is it possible that I happen to live at a time when this big seismic change is going to happen? Or is that just the typical arrogance of thinking that our time is more important than anyone else's time in history? And my colleague Sally Gorner has helped me put this all into perspective, and again, getting back to this distinction between holistic thinking and reductionist thinking. I think where we are is at another era of great change, similar to the first scientific revolution, where we essentially ushered in the modern age out of the medieval age. And the medieval age was essentially ruled by the church. The Pope had a direct line to God, and this is at least in the Western context. And the church sort of set the rules for society, and an order was established. And then a guy named Copernicus came along and suggested that the Earth is not the center of the universe, the sun is. And he held that idea privately until his death, because it was so challenging to the church and the doctrine. It sort of unsettled the worldview of the church, which is that the Earth is the center of the universe, the church is at the center of the Earth, and the Pope has the direct line to God. And as you pointed out earlier, Galileo proved this with his telescope and was put in house arrest and told never to talk about that. And so the point is that when there's a shift in era, it's very challenging and threatening.
By the Pope. By the Pope, Galileo.
Galileo was put in house arrest by the Pope.
Yeah.
By the then Pope, roughly 400 years ago. And the point is that these shifts are very challenging to the power base in power. And I think a similar thing is happening today, and I somewhat tongue-in-cheek joke that the current Pope is essentially the Pope of economics, because we all, in a sense, bow down to neoliberal economics as if it's the law. And but what we're learning in the sciences, and certainly in the consciousness work that I'm learning about, is that there's a whole new way of understanding emergent that is integral and integrated, and not reductionist. And so it's the natural swing back from 400 years of the pursuit of this reductionist method, which is fabulously important and has brought us airplanes and cell phones and all this great stuff, but is a method. It's not actually the way the world works. And so I think the chaos we all experience is the rumbling of this shift that sort of hasn't happened in 400 years, so it's going to be disruptive, out of the modern age and into some new age, which more and more people are calling the integral age. And it's going to transcend every discipline of knowledge, from healthcare to economics. And it's going to be very disruptive and very threatening to the existing power base.
Could you just add a little bit more color to the modern age? Because I think the description of the medieval is really clear, but so it went from medieval to modern, okay. And then now it's...
Yeah, well, so the modern age was brought about by Copernicus and Galileo, led to Newton and the establishment of modern physics. It's the pursuit of knowledge based on a fact-based analysis, the scientific method, which again, obviously brought tremendous progress to the world. It wasn't a mistake. It's not like we need to undo that. We need to now go forward. And what the modern scientific age is premised on, though, is that in order to understand things that are really complicated, we need to reduce them down to their understandable parts. And so we now have specialists in everything under the sun. And if you go to your doctor, you have to see a specialist for your liver, a different specialist for your arm, a different one for your heart. And that was all necessary to really drill down and understand these individual parts. But of course, our health is a function of all the parts working together as a whole. And so now there's a whole field of integrated medicine, which is a response to the reductionist approach to healthcare. And I think that's happening in the law, it's happening in education, it's happening in public planning, urban planning, and I believe it needs to happen in economics.
And I think it's very important to also add that one big, because I agree with the kind of the rumbling of structures, and there we are coming actually back to what we talked about before, which is relation. Because I think we have to be prepared that there will be massive cultural changes and structures will change. But often change can be a very threatening thing. So, and what is the kind of, the thing that really supports change is belonging. If we strengthen relation, like appropriate relation is a kind of a ground that when we feel safe enough to change, we change. But if we feel very insecure and scared and frightened, we try to hold on to the old. So,
as the Pope did.
Right.
And as the economics profession is now doing.
Right.
In a sense.
Right.
And finance in particular.
Right. And then I think in the gravity of a system, because in the kind of a mystical, in the inner science, we look at it as systems or structures have a kind of a gravity, kind of the table wants to stay a table. My body has a coherence. Structures have a coherence, and the structure has kind of a function to stay the structure. But now when change is coming, change is a kind of a new impulse, and we need a certain activation energy to change the old structures and allow them to integrate the new, the innovation. And so I believe now we meet two aspects that might jeopardize change, which is on the one hand strong habits and addictions to the structures that we have, and trauma. So habits is something that we need to open up through practice and activation energy. Trauma in a system, when we push too much energy onto trauma, it will actually hold more. So when we want to change a corporation, when we want to bring innovation into systems, the traumatized aspect that is epidemic is a very important part why sometimes it's very hard to change systems. Because there's individual trauma in many people, there is collective traumatization, and so that's really a factor that we have to think about. And the other part is that we are living in a time where I believe for the first time many people spend what I call global time. Whenever I walk with my cell phone and I spend time searching websites or Facebook or anything, I think I spend global time. That's a a web around the world that hasn't been there before. So we created already a bigger system that we are already part of. The question is, do I really control my cell phone, or does technology already have such an important place in my life that without technology and banking and all kinds of stuff, I'm not able to live in the current culture as it is. And so it's very interesting to think about the new web that many people have access right now in all kinds of parts of the world to information, to all kinds of unfiltered information, but there's a kind of a global learning. And that global net is a huge change factor within our individual and collective experience. And I think so that's interesting, the exposure and the speed of data and information and how much pressure it creates and how much possibility it holds. And to think about change as like opening old habits and attachments to structures, that creates one kind of resistance, but it needs a certain intervention. But trauma creates another invisible attachment, and if I don't recognize trauma, developmental and individual and collective trauma, it will be kind of, it will look like as my enemy if I want to implement change. It appears as a strong resistance to move. And so that's something I think we really have to take care of if you want to, every innovation will kind of have a backlash of resistance of the system. But there are two forces in the system, and if they are not kind of discerned well, so it will actually freeze or slow down the movement of the system.
Yeah, or I would, and so that's beautiful. It triggers so many thoughts. One is for our kids, who some are better able to adapt into this web world than others, and some are simply not. They're not comfortable in it, and it's causing real pain, I think. But the second thought is that, going back to kind of universal principles, energy flow principles, there's energy building that has to go somewhere, and it's, we don't really have a choice but to adapt and respond to this. Right. So I don't know how our trauma that's resisting it, ultimately the forces, I think, have to overwhelm, and either we break or we adapt. Right.
Right, and that's a huge breaking point. Because the forces of change, if you say the future is calling us and the past has a gravity. So a human being is the creative tension or the destructive tension in between. So there's something that calls me into the future. We're very excited because it's sexy to innovate. It's sexy to bring new stuff because it's eros. And that eros has a drive. It's looking for oxygen. The fire needs oxygen. And so something in us wants to go forward, and I think it's very healthy. It's the becoming part of a human being. We want to aspire, we want to have a future. So that's great, but the gravity of the system, if we don't recognize how deeply ingrained, even in our genetics, the traumatizing aspects of the past and our current life experience kind of is an invisible breaking point in the system, that if we don't take care of it in the right way, it will be like sand in the engine. But if we take care of it in the right way, it's our ally. It's with us. But we just need to be skillful to take it with us.
So there's this great potential that exists, but there's also the danger of another dark age.
Right. Right.
So I put the paper out you referred to, Regenerative Capitalism, How Universal Principles and Patterns Will Shape the Next Economy, in 2015. And 2 months later, the Pope's encyclical came out. And in the encyclical, so I read the encyclical as a call for regenerative economics, even though it came out after. And what I mean by that is that the Pope called for a more a humanism with an integrated vision, and I forget the language. It was much more beautiful than anything I've written, but it called for an integration across multiple disciplines, including economics, for a more integral society. And so there is this call for a new economics paradigm. Obviously, there was much more in that encyclical than just economics. But it's the irony is beautiful, that it is the modern Pope who is totally aligned with integral science in calling for this reconnection of science and spirit, when his predecessor 400 years ago was the one trying to keep down science. So maybe that's a clue for this how we navigate this, either great potential or great risk. But somehow, the Pope, and I'm not Catholic, this isn't about Catholicism, this is about one of our great spiritual leaders, understanding the need for this reintegration of science and spirit. In many ways, it's the reintegration of science and spirit, Eastern and Western thinking, masculine and feminine thinking, all into one thinking.
Right. I totally agree that I think our time is about, we are part of a wedding ceremony, and that's inner and outer science, and there is a baby. And I think the inner development Like understanding inner human development means understanding inner human design, understanding inner architecture that is the basis or the instrument to play the music of the external cultural design. So if we understand, wow, that if the parts of me, my nervous system and my internal experience, the parts that I'm not aware of and that are not accessible for me to have a conscious experience of, that aspect will find an external, it's like a projection onto the world. And so, like what is culture? Culture is a set of agreements. What the laws are agreements, they're cultural agreements, they're agreements that we tend to keep or we tend to violate. And so it's relation. And the restoration of human relations is the basis for any kind of change. And even that through inner development, I believe change is a competence. Change is not something that happens to us. Change is something that we can be equipped for, and we can train the necessary aspects to be or to remember that we are movement. A human being is not a fixed particle. A human being is intelligence in movement. When I look into myself, everything that I can define in myself is actually, in its deepest aspect, movement. Up to the atoms and sub-particles and everything's moving. So the whole universe, what in the universe is static?
Yeah, even
Nothing.
the table is moving.
Yeah, everything. It has just a very slow speed of movement.
Yeah.